Good afternoon and welcome to this special and timely conversation on the recent events in Niger. I'm Ramayad, Senior Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. I am delighted to host you all today for an in-depth discussion on recent developments on this important topic. Since July 26, President Bazoum of Niger is detained somewhere by the military who seized the power in Niamey. On August 7, the deadline issued by the Economic Community of West African States, the Ecowas, for Niger to restore the constitutional order expired. The coup leaders have appointed a new government while the Ecowas threatens to deploy a military intervention. 1 month after the coup, many questions are still there for observers on how the situation will unfold. In today's discussion, our experts will look to analyze when or if civilian rules will return to Niger. The role of ECOWAS too will play under Nigeria's leadership in resolving the crisis is important, and what it means for the US, France, Russia, and China and other countries in the region will be also considered. Niger was the sixth coup in the region in 3 years. We were planning to discuss that when yesterday we heard about the new coup, the seventh, in Gabon, now in Central Africa. The events of the last hours offer the opportunity to also analyze this trend. The Africa Center is honored to be joined today by experts from across the Atlantic Council, from the Freedom and Prosperity Center, the Europe Center, the Rafik Hariri Center, Middle East, and the Africa Center. Thank you, dear colleagues. To moderate the panel, we have the pleasure of having David Andelman with us. David is a Voices columnist for CNN, the executive director of the Red Lines Project, and author of the Substack page Andelman Unleashed. David is an award-winning author, editor, and publisher. He is the author of 5 books, and he's president emeritus of the Overseas Press Club, and the Silurians Press Club, the oldest club in America for veteran journalists. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. It's really a privilege to moderate this session of the Africa Center. Time for choices in Niger and beyond, especially after Africa's latest coup, as you mentioned in the pre-dawn hours yesterday in Gabon. So we have an extraordinarily gifted panel of Atlantic Council experts assembled. Let me run them down for you. Joseph Lemoyne, the Deputy Director of Freedom and Prosperity Center of the Atlantic Council, Karim Mezran, Director of the North Africa Initiative and Resident Senior Fellow of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East Programs of the Atlantic Council, Dr. Michael Shirkin, Senior Fellow at the Africa Center of the Atlantic Council, and Peter Tuma, Visiting Fellow of the European Center of the Atlantic Council. So let me, if I may, set the stage just for a moment here. We have at least 6 or 9 military takeovers, depending on how you count them, in Africa in the past 3 years alone. The entire Sahel is now effectively ruled by military juntas, in turn leaving the road open to China, or especially Russia, even with the viability of the Wagner group suddenly in question. The most recent and really the most toxic coup being in Niger, where the democratically elected president is effectively under house arrest with his family, the nation under threat of invasion by neighbors to restore him to office. And then, of course, there's yesterday's coup in Gabon, which seems to me, at least on the surface, quite welcome as deposing the kleptocratic Bongo family that's ruled for at least half a century. So I'd like to go around to each of you with a question that should play to your special expertise, and then we can throw it open to everybody. So let me start with Dr. Shirkin, with your background at RAND Corporation. And we know by yourself you've actually visited Mali, indeed Timbuktu. It's a wonderful picture of you at the Timbuktu airport, such as it is. So how viable are militaries in these countries, but especially and immediately Niger, to rule in a fashion that can deal with the many problems of the people of these countries?
The Nigerian armed forces have a very good reputation. They're considered quite capable, very effective, particularly in light of their very small size. The issue, though, is not about their abilities to fight and their military capabilities. It's more that most experts agree that in order to deal with something like a jihadist insurgency or any kind of insurgency, one needs what people call a global approach. which means that you have to deal not just with the security aspects, but you also have to think about development and politics and try to come up with political accommodations and try to address the concerns of the population. And it really requires a whole of government approach. President Bazoum had been, at least better than anybody in the region, doing exactly that. And generally speaking, one has good reason to be skeptical that these officers are going to follow a similar approach. One's inclined to think that they're going to be, I'm inclined to think that they're going to really more focus on the security aspects. And that is often very problematic and counterproductive. And as a result, a lot of us observers, I think, are very concerned that from a strategic point of view, this new junta is going to do a worse job of dealing with the insurgency than President Bazoum did, even if the officers are claiming that Bazoum did a bad job and that they're going to do a better job.
Very good point. Peter Tuma, let's turn, since you're our visiting expert from Europe Center, and since I know French President Emmanuel Macron fairly well, he awarded me the Legion d'honneur 2 years ago. Let me ask you whether you share my astonishment that in Gabon, the former French colony where the military seems to have brought an end to the half century of kleptocratic rule by the Bongo family, that the Macron government has come down very much on the side of the Bongos and against this junta, while at the same time, the French confronting the junta in Niger, at every point, they've made all kinds of threats, and so far they haven't carried them out, but they're certainly out there. And equally, the State Department seems to have sent similar messages on both fronts. So how do you explain this?
Yeah, I'd say I share your astonishment. I've been surprised to hear about what happened in Gabon yesterday. It's been one of the most stable countries in the region. You know, the dynasty, one dynasty ruling there over 40 years, and quite prosperous for the regional standards country. Thus. Also with the strong military presence, I'd say that one of the biggest French military bases there, part of the French network in Africa, known as France-Afrique, and obviously unconstitutional takeover of the government is something what has to be refused. By Europeans, by Americans, by the West, because it can further spread the contagion of the military coups, of the putsches in the region. There is a considerable differences between Niger and Gabon. I'd say first we saw an important support from the population for the change. People were really supporting. It was not case in Niger, at least in the very beginning, when where only few were gathering in the streets and supporting the putsch in the beginning. Only few in Niger were waving Russian flags. We haven't seen anything like this in Gabon. We haven't heard from putschists any criticism of France presence, French military presence there. This is also something different. We don't have there huge security issues. We don't have jihadists acting on the ground there as in Niger. So we have really see these differences. And the major probably is that in Niger we had democratically elected president, somebody who was pushing the reforms. He was also successful on the field of fight against the jihadism, which is not the case in Gabon. There, I would say. I served a long term in the Middle East, and the government there. It reminds me a bit of Emirates, you know, like you have a wealthy ruler, and then people who are not probably so happy, and even the split between rich governors and poor people is bigger than in the Emirates. Thus, there is larger support for the change.
So that which goes directly to my next question, and I'd like to bring in Joseph Lemoyne for this. I'm especially interested in freedom and prosperity. How can this military junta in Niger possibly move their country toward freedom and prosperity when their action, with a single stroke, they've cut off the country virtually entirely from the outside world, erased most foreign subsidies, and been declared effectively pariahs?
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you for the Africa Center for inviting us. I think to answer this question, it's important to bring a little bit of context. Niger is one of the least prosperous countries in the world. So not only in GDP per capita, but in overall prosperity, it ranks 158 out of 164 countries covered by the Atlantic Council Prosperity Index. So the Atlantic Council produces the Freedom and Prosperity Index, which rank 164 countries on freedom and on prosperity, so two separate rankings. And so Niger is at the bottom of the prosperity index. And there has been some progress from 95 to 2013, but since then it's been stagnating. So it is a country where over the past 10 years, there has been no progress on prosperity. And that creates discontent, right? There has been a little bit of growth, but not as much as we would want. And we measure education, and I think this is striking. It ranks at the bottom of the ranking. So it is a country where there is no public services. They have been failing to provide prosperity for their people. If we look at our data, what you need to create a prosperous society, you generally need three things, which is political freedom, economic freedom, some level of economic freedom, and the rule of law. And Niger is actually doing some things pretty well. On political freedom, it is true that it's one of the most free country in the region, especially on political rights and civil liberties. It's doing very well. It ranks, I think, 74 on political freedom, which is great. But it's really on economic freedom and the rule of law where there is the most room for improvement. There has been some improvement on economic freedom, but it's just not enough. And this is reflected in the very, very slow growth. But I think the challenge that lays ahead is on the rule of law. So your institution, like how secure is your country, how efficient is your judicial system, how much can you bring people into the formal economy, and so on. The rule of law has been declining consistently over the past 30 years. And the main driver is security, of course, which, to give you an idea of what has been happening, the country lost 30 percentage points. If it were to be at the same level as it was 30 years ago, it would be in the top 60 in the world. Today, it's at the bottom 15, right? So it is one of the less secure country in the world. We see a positive impact of what President Bazoum has been doing since he took office, but the long is going to be very long to go back. But I think the country also has been failing to fix corruption. And this, our research showed that the rule of law is actually the main driver for discontent among populations. Having election is great, but if you don't fix your security, your corruption, and your judicial system, that's going to hold you back. To go back to your question of what's ahead, having 20 years of data, we can actually see the impact of the 96 coup, the 99 coup, and the 2010 coup. And what we see a dent in the progress, a recovery, and then a plateau, meaning that every single military that did a coup, failed at actually bringing progress afterwards. The level of freedom, the level of democracy has been stagnant for the past 30 years. So the challenge will be really to do the reforms that need to be done. Security is obviously one, but I think institutional reform, economic liberalization is going to be essential. And without these, the country will continue to struggle.
Okay, yes, indeed. You mentioned the path forward, and Ambassador Yada is very interested in the path forward. So Karim Mezran, finally, I'm especially interested in Niger in that respect, also Gabon, of course, but the Niger junta has said it's prepared to return to civilian rule in 3 years. Now, that's really an eternity in a nation that's so struggling against violent jihadists and deep poverty. The Algerian foreign minister proposed a 6-month return to civilian rule. Algeria's refused a French request to transit its airspace for any military operation in Niger, but the Nigerian junta seems to be standing by this 3-year rule. How much sway do you think Algeria, or indeed any other North African country, might have in Niger in terms of moving the junta either to return to civilian rule or accelerate that prospect?
Well, thank you very much, Nelly. I'm always very surprised anytime I look at the map of the Sahel in North Africa, how important, how big is Algeria. Libya is big too, and it has a lot of borders. But Algeria, if you see geographically, is in the middle of it. There's no way that Algeria can escape its a Sahelian or southern involvement. Despite the fact that for many years Algeria has been very absent in the period of since its third world days and Pan-Africanism of the early 1980s, Algeria sort of swayed away because of the internal domestic issue, because of the terrorism, the decade, and then it took a long time before they found a strong president like Bouteflika who started re-engaging Algeria. Then he was sick and he fell ill, and Algeria disappeared from the map. In North Africa, in Africa, anywhere, they thought they included instead. It's about a year, maybe a year and a half, that Tebboune has sort of, the new president has sort of solidified its power. And we've seen already the projection of power of Algeria, the changing of the constitution that allows them, that prohibited them before to use their army outside their borders. The threat that they sent to the Egyptians when they were moving into Libya to support Haftar, and they posed an ultimatum and counterbalanced the Egyptians. And so the way they are behaving with Tunisia now and how they're incorporated, there's a new activism. If I was kind of surprised at the beginning when I saw that the reaction to the Niger coup was, hold on, we condemn the coup strongly, but we are against any foreign intervention into the area. Any armed situation will be considered a direct threat to the Algerian national security. This is Algeria, this is the maximum they can say, which is like, don't you dare do that, we will intervene this time. But at the same time, what is they want to do? And then they came with the proposal of the 6 months, which is reasonable to the Algeria. Let's forget that Algeria is a civilian government, but it's a military state. It is the idea that with 6 months we can manage the military to find a passage to a suitable civilian government that we can then present and move. That I think is what the general do. The other message that Tebboune said very clearly, the president of Algeria, he said there is no way that any peace or war can be done in the Sahel, in the country, without us getting involved in it. So I think that there is a lot. We are going to see a lot of that. Algeria has to have a projection of power to the south because it's blocking the other south. Morocco too has its policy. Libya is a disaster because you have Haftar who says that Haftar took a position in favor of the coup, but he said we are against ECOWAS intervention. Go figure what it means. While the government in Tripoli said we are against the coup. Go figure what he wants to do. But well, all these other actors are less important, but less important. Algeria is the one that, correctly as you pointed out, we should focus on and pay our attention because they will be acting.
You mentioned the military issue, and I think we need now to turn really to the elephant in the room, or should I say, the grizzly. Russia, especially the Wagner group. The junta in Niger is reported to have had discussions with Wagner just shortly before Prigozhin's assassination. Something very interesting came across about an hour or so ago. I noticed on one of the Telegram channels attributed to the Wagner group that I follow, I had a brand new video of Prigozhin, which claims to have been just published, suggesting that perhaps he might not indeed have met his maker. I seriously doubt that that's the case. I think this was probably recorded in Africa just before he, in fact, went up on that ill-fated flight. But at any rate, the junta in Niger is reported to have had discussions with Wagner just shortly before Prigozhin's assassination. How viable a role do any of you think Wagner can now play in Niger, or indeed any other African country where it's already deeply implanted, without a strong leader, without a strong central purpose and direction? Where is that going to go, do you think? I'll open that up to anybody who wants to answer. And perhaps Michael, you would most directly.
Yeah, if I may, the problem with the Wagner is that it was both a creature of Prigozhin, but also an instrument of the Russian state, which meant that it has deep resources that ultimately go well beyond sort of the Prigozhin facade. And it's really very difficult to assess. I mean, I know for the last year I've been asking Russia experts about whether or not Wagner can keep doing what it's doing in Africa, given that it's so engaged in Ukraine and so many of its people dealing with Ukraine. And the answer was like, really nobody knows, because ultimately it all depends on how many resources the Russian state wants to put behind it. So here
Well,
again,
Michael, there are 5,000 Wagner troops apparently still in Belarus that are just itching to get into action. So in theory, there are some reserves that could be brought into play.
well, I mean, there could always be more, but again, it's the Russian state supports it, and what Wagner has been doing in Africa has the absolute backing of the Russian state. And so it's really a question of whether or not the Russian state thinks that it's still in its interest for these sorts of activities to continue. So my bet is that that Wagner, or rebranded Wagner, or, you know, it's like when what's it called? Eric Prince's mercenary group would, Blackwater would, because it kept rebranding itself. I don't even know what it's called now, right? And create new corporate shells and new brands. So it might change from that point of view. But the actual activities, the patrolling that Wagner's doing the Russians, I should say, are doing in Mali or in Central African Republic, etc., that I think will probably continue as long as the Russian state thinks that it's in its interest to do so. And it's just a question of decoupling it from Wagner and making sure that other people are profiting from it, right? So it will go to, I believe it's already been assigned to somebody close to Putin. So it's a big question mark. Nobody really knows the answer, but I think the safe bet is that we're going to see pretty much more of the same thing.
Can I ask a question?
A little depressing. Kareem, yes.
Michael, don't you think that there's a possibility, hypothetical, I'm just talking about hypothetical, that it breaks down into feuds, like those who are in Mali will prosper through racketeering, crime, stuff, those who are in Niger, and the various groups of Wagner, ex-Wagner soldiers, now that they've lost the leader, they've lost the vision, they've lost the person, will not respect Putin and his orders, and will self-maintain. Just
that's
what I've been seeing in Libya. That's what they're doing now, by the way.
Right. I mean, it's good to hear that. I think it's a distinct possibility, but I also think that if I were a mercenary, a Russian mercenary, and I'm stuck in central, eastern, northeastern Mali, I am surviving by means of a very sort of very thin logistical umbilical cord, and it's difficult to survive out there. And so the question is, you know, in a sense, one's own survival is at play, because otherwise, right, there's no food, there's no water, there's no ammunition. So do you completely go rogue in that environment and try to sort of survive on yourself simply through predation? Maybe, I mean, that's possible. Or is the safe thing to do is just to sort of rally to whoever's going to show up, some sort of manager who's going to show up and say, hey guys, I'm your new boss, and, you know, and we've got a new Antonov scheduled to come into Bamako full of supplies, or Gao. And so I would say, yeah, it's certainly possible, but I really wouldn't bet on it. Just watch.
I'd like to look broaden the template a bit, if we could, and look at how much of a template might the West African states' handling of the Niger junta be in serving as a deterrence to future coups. In fact, I have a couple of questions that have come in here from our listeners. Is this coup wave a real trend? What countries are next? How can the world prevent it? Why haven't we seen an Ecowas or Nigerian-led intervention so far? So what the West African states' handling of this coup so far has been rather, well, let's say, light, shall we say, a light touch. And the question is whether more of a heavy touch might be necessary, or this becomes a template for future coups. Joseph, maybe you might think about talking about that a little bit, no?
Yeah, it is. So I've been looking at, always bring it back to the data. I've been looking at the situation in, you know, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and all of them, in all these countries, less so Guinea, but in all these countries, you know, we've been failing, the French, and we've been failing at providing security in the region. It's been under constant decline. And there has been, you know, little done on positive institutional reform over the past 20 years. That's, I think the question, I mean, the Gabon case feels different because it's a very different context, it's a very different geographical place and a different country, so it feels differently. So the timing just really brings the question of like, okay, is this happening? Are we having a spread of coup all over these countries? But the big question here, I think, is it's not only about military stability and all that, but really about development models. Because Niger, you know, is a country that had many coups in the past, fourth coup in the past 30 years. But what's new is really this anti-French sentiment. And I think when we start thinking about, you know, what is the proper answer to the situation, I think it's very important to make sure that this anti-French sentiment does not translate into a pro-autocratic model movement. Having the Wagner group run your security, it means having Russian values being promoted, right? And I don't think that's the answer to bring prosperity in these countries. If you know, and it's not a matter of Western values or anything like that. You know, freedom and prosperity exist in every single country in the world, and these are universal values that work. I think the real danger long term is really the rise of pro-autocratic models in the region.
Petter, do you agree? I mean, I just want to add, before you talk, Petter, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, but don't you think that the French response to this is also only to encourage these kinds of models in the future, particularly when you come to Gabon?
Yeah, I will let Petter answer. I'm sure he has a better answer than I do.
Go ahead. What do you mean by French response in Gabon?
Well, the French basically said, you know, return the country to its civilian rule and to the people who won the last election, which is, you know, so yeah. And in Niger, of course, they came up with a tough response, and nothing has followed from that. There have been no interventions. So there we are.
I would question Joseph's sequence when he said that there was first, as if I understand it properly, that there was first anti-French sentiment, and that built on this anti-French sentiment, it could follow with the authoritarian push in the region. I'm rather inclined to see it vice versa, that they were first those who were leaning towards the authoritarianism, and we're not very happy with what we were trying to impose there as European, as French, as Western values based, and they just find the bouc émissaire, the scapegoat, the French. You know, everything what was bad there was done by French, as in Algeria for 60 years, or elsewhere by Americans. And I think this is something what can be related to your previous question with Russians. I think that in Mali especially, and then partly in Burkina, and not so much in Niger, and not at all in Gabon now. Those coups happened because there was somebody who was happy and ready to help them afterwards. These were Russians. These were Russians who seized the opportunity. I wouldn't say at all that Wagner staged the coup, but once it happened, and the leaders, especially Goïta, after the first or even after the second coup in Mali, 2021, they were reflecting where to go and were discussing how long these transition periods should be. Like now we will have probably in Gabon. The Russians came and they said, "Look, guys, you can have it longer than Europeans, and we will help you. We will protect you." This helped the coup spread. This helped them to move farther against us. Then it happened in Burkina. Then it happened in Niger. And you have already a coup alliance. You have more people, and you don't need those Russians to be behind. You already, you are enough to push your authoritarian model in the region. I would say also on Russians, they are probably better off than we think still in Moscow, and this is quite important for them. All the Ukraine invasion is about revisionism, and in Africa it's also about revisionism. So they won't give up, and it's not. They don't need much there. Few thousand of mercenaries. They can withstand it. And they were not stabilizing country as we were trying to do in Mali and in all Sahel with Barkhane and with other operations. Their aim was to keep safe regimes and probably do some counterterrorism operations to show that they do something like this. But the country won't stabilize even with Russians there. So my bet is they will stay there to a certain extent, but don't expect that the security situation will improve. Look at what's going on in Mali and Burkina. It is decreasing. The security it's getting worse 2 years after the coup, after our departure.
Well, also, Michael, my sense is that they really don't need much help from Russia itself in terms of sustaining this operation in Africa, particularly in some of these countries. They're taking out such huge quantities of gold, diamonds, and other rare earths and other minerals that they really have become quite a profitable, shall we say, a profit center for Wagner and for much of the Russian military establishment. So, but I'd really like to talk a little bit about Ecowas and do you think that Ecowas should have, in fact, what about the risk of setting off a broader war by a military intervention in Niger in particular? That may be what's holding back Ecowas and possibly the United States as well. Is that appropriate, or is the time passing when this would be really effective, and is the junta digging in, and it will be that much more difficult to pry them out from any military intervention?
Well, a few points. First of all, I want to say that it's not clear that Wagner's making any money in Mali. There are cash payments to Mali, or at least ostensibly, but they have no mining operations. They're not taking anything out of the ground. It seems to be, my estimate, my bet is that it's an at loss. It's like a loss leader to try to attract more customers. They're not making money. It's also not really clear if they're doing anything at all in Burkina Faso. But also, in terms of the French response and ECOWAS's response, and so I'll use this as sort of a segue, but there's really not a whole lot either France or ECOWAS can do, unless in the sense of France. I mean, France could do anything, right? Within 24 hours, they could launch a huge invasion and have a whole brigade there within like a week. They're not about to do that, and just because they don't want to play that kind of colonial role, like they know better than that. So they don't want to do that. And they're really hoping that just sort of internal pressures in Niger are going to kind of take over, and enough Nigerians will come to the better senses that there'll be some sort of course correction. But the French themselves don't want to lift a finger. Now, maybe the situation with the French diplomat, maybe that's going to spark a confrontation. I don't know. The same thing with ECOWAS. I mean, there's not a lot ECOWAS can do. And so ECOWAS with...
I mean, the Nigerians have a huge military force. There are certainly other, and presumably if the Nigerians came in, the French would come in a much bigger way than they have.
Possibly, but I mean, so ECOWAS tried harsh sanctions with Mali and they didn't work. And if anything, it just galvanized the public behind the Malian regime. This time around, they have sanctions against Niger, but it's a safe bet that the sanctions aren't really going to do a whole lot. But also, the idea of a military intervention is really just sort of it's a very dicey thing. Collectively, ECOWAS does have the military capabilities to do such a thing. However, it does take a lot of time to organize, time to plan. They don't have rapid reaction forces the way the US and France do. And in a sense, Tinubu's ultimatum was premature. He said, I'm going to give you a week or else, but there's nowhere else because it's going to take like a month or two to organize it or else. And then the problem is that if there were to be a military intervention, anybody I know that been talking about this, like when we ask ourselves, but to do what? To like a big land invasion, airborne operation, what are they actually intending to do? And how is that going to help anybody? And how do you then present a situation that's going to be stable, that's not going to create even more problems than they already have? And so France is pretty gung-ho, at least about the diplomacy, and has supported ECOWAS. But it's also not clear to me that the French are going to support it, because I think that the French should be hesitant. For one thing, the French know that any assistance that they give to ECOWAS, or even the appearance of assistance and the perception of assistance, to some extent might be a kiss of death with regard to any legitimacy that an ECOWAS intervention might have. And the US is going to be doing the same thing, kind of eyeballing this and thinking like, oh, right, like, how is this going to help anything? And how do we do something that's going to be positive and constructive rather than negative and deconstructive? And I mean, the US, of course, does want to support Tinubu, does want to support Nigeria, does want to support ECOWAS, because the US has a lot of reasons to be backing all of these things. But at the same time, nobody should be enthusiastic about a military intervention, because it's just sort of so fraught and dicey. And then, to get back to your comment about this being a pattern for future coups, I think it absolutely is, because it shows the impunity with which putschists can act. Since the international community is unwilling to act for very good reasons, right? And the regional authorities, there are others in Africa, not just ECOWAS, they are generally, their abilities to act is highly limited. And so at the end of the day, odds are, if you have a putsch, you can probably get away with it. And this is all the more true in a place like Gabon, where the international community, other than the principle of the thing, doesn't have a lot at stake. I mean, France and Gabon used to have a very tight relationship. It was always sort of a poster child for France-Afrique. That really isn't true anymore. And except for that French military base, do the French really care if the Bongo family falls? Like, does it really matter? Because everybody knows how bad they are. And otherwise, you don't have economic interests at stake the way it used to be the case 20, 30 years ago. Same thing with Niger. I mean, Niger is the contrast. In Niger, both the United States and France have considerable equities at play. We've invested a lot of money in helping the Nigerian deal with their terrorism problem. No such thing has been happening in Gabon. So in other words, there's no investment that we and the French wish to protect. So I do think they're going to be more coups, because these putschists have demonstrated the extent to which they can go ahead and do so with complete impunity.
So let's look at the U.S. What should the U.S. position be there? Let's talk about that. It seems to be somewhat divergent from France or even ECOWAS. The U.S. has been basically saying this. I mean, Blinken has had a couple of statements I've monitored them, where he has actually said, this must be solved by diplomatic means. Well, obviously, diplomacy isn't working very effectively in Niger, particularly these days. Victoria Nuland, who was the acting number two in the State Department, went in there and she basically wasn't even seen by the top guy in the top general in the junta, and she had a quick press conference and then beat it out to the airport, as quickly as she could to get out of Dodge. That's not a very. What should the United States be doing differently? This. Let's come up with a recipe of some kind that we can sell to perhaps any of the any State Department people who may be online here and who may be listening afterwards. Anybody have any thoughts that they want to share with our State Department leaders?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to hold back and let the others pipe in.
Very briefly before I let the true experts talk, but no, I think the for the French at least the political risk of an intervention is too great. I think the anti-French sentiment is well ingrained, and I think even if the intervention is successful on the military front, I think long term, when it comes to the stability of the region and the influence of the French, I don't see a scenario where this would end up in being a positive outcome. Historically, the U.S. have been supporting the French position in the region. It was sort of the gentleman agreement, like we support you here, and you support us in the Middle East, right? But if I had one advice, I think actually now a lot of the situation rests on the role of and the position of the US. And if I had one advice, it would be talk to the French. I don't think that the French need to be leading any initiative, but they obviously know the region, better than no one else. And I think communication between the two is going to be essential.
Karim, you mentioned Libya as the chaos there. Is that potentially a model that, I mean, the West, even the Americans and the French couldn't get, or the British couldn't get together really on some real decision on who to support in Libya. Is this a potentially chaotic model that you see spreading to places like Niger or other countries in the future in sub-Saharan Africa?
If these countries are left alone by themselves, all the foreigners, the regional powers, the international powers are allowed to enter without any control, without it will be a disaster. Libya is a prototype of that. A country that was helped to have a revolution, it was not a revolution, it was a civil war, was then plunged into this masses of militias. Each regional power had its own, and so on. I agree with it. It should not happen. But I want to have another thing regarding the military intervention. As I said before, if a giant like Algeria says that it's not happening, it's not going to happen. Whether the Americans, the French, Algeria prohibited the French to pass their airspace. I really don't see any possibility for anyone, including Ecowas, to enter into Niger and getting out of it without Algerians and some other neighboring states intervening, and there would be havoc.
Well, they can't really get any military forces in that region without flying across Algeria, really, right? That's not a viable entry yet, but perhaps maybe via Libya, but that's pretty dicey also, right?
No, that's not true. I'm sorry, but you can go around Algeria. It adds a lot to your flight time, but it can absolutely be done.
Okay.
But once you get down there without their acceptance, you might get bombed rapidly.
We have a question, interesting question. I think it was Petter who mentioned the Emirates is the question. Is the UAE or any other outside powers have influence in Niger or any other countries who've fallen victim to this coup wave? What do you think? Petter, it was addressed to you, so.
Well, I probably mentioned Emirates, but I was thinking about the Emirate, like the oil Emirates, like not necessarily the Emirates.
Okay.
I don't know. I would leave the others to assess the influence of the Gulfies, of other regional players in Niger.
I didn't get
Definitely.
The question, David, is the influence of the Emirates in the Sahel. Was that the question, or am I mistaken?
Yes. Well, the Emirates or any other regional power. I mean, the Saudis, for instance, the Saudis don't have a lot of interest in that part of Africa. They were interested, I think, in Eastern Africa.
What I know is that the Egyptians have trained a lot of the armies of the Sahel in an anti-Turkish function. When the Turkish were trying to, the Turks penetrated a lot in the Horn of Africa. They are trying to penetrate as well in the West. And it seems that the Egyptians had the capacity to have training and stuff. I don't know how much true that is. They try to offset the Turkish influence by going there. The Emirates are trying to play influence in every country of the world. Wherever they see an opportunity to enter, block their antagonists and to intervene and do something, they will do. I don't know particularly of Niger, but I wouldn't be that surprised to see some of their influence.
I would like to go around to all of you and ask you, because we're coming down to our last quarter hour. I'd like to have you reflect on Russia or Wagner waiting in the wings, possibly of real democracy waiting in the wings. Are you concerned that this is Niger could be an Africa-Ukraine that requires some military intervention to preserve some kind of return to some kind of a semblance of democracy? Is this a potentially Niger and an African Ukraine, particularly if Wagner comes in there? Where do you see this going in the future, and what kind of an off-ramp do you see? They've been talking a lot about off-ramps in Ukraine. So let's go around to each one of you again. We'll start since I did originally with Michael. What do you see as the future in that part of the world, and the possibility of restraining future military actions like this that could lead to changing governments?
So just very quickly, you'd asked about the State Department, and I think the State Department's current response, although it's very unsatisfactory, might actually be appropriate, which is to try to take a principled stand against the coup, while also trying to open the door, maintain chains of communication to the putschists, so that we at least can talk. And if we, conscious of what Joseph said, I'm not really sure we need to talk to the French other than simply reassuring the French that whatever it is we're doing ultimately is not contrary to French interests, which I think is actually true. But also, I just want to tack on, the UAE is relatively a bit player. The major economic power from the outside that really counts is China. China is the one with the major investments, these in Niger. The Chinese, I'm sure, being very quiet, not doing anything. But the Niger, junta's going to really care about what the Chinese government's going to say, because they're the ones with all the big investment projects. But the Ukraine analogy, I think, is very poor. I think it's just a question of, I think the greater problem is just this sort of turn away from democracy. There's this huge democratization movement in Africa that took place in the early 1990s, and there's a wave of elections, and a lot of countries have been struggling with various results to try to become democratic. I think a lot of people in these countries have become frustrated, and they don't think that these democratic regimes, either they don't think that they're legitimately democratic, rightly or wrongly, depends on the case, or they just don't see these democratic governments as responding to their needs. And so they're tempted by autocracy. They have this notion that maybe autocrats are going to do a better job. And I think that it would be wrong to focus too much on Wagner, too much on Russian influence. I think they're a problem, but they're more like a nuisance. They're like a thorn in the side rather than a serious problem. And as long as the problem exists, bigger problems exist, then this thorn will remain in place, and the Russians will continue to sort of find opportunities to poke their fingers into the situation and make matters worse. But having some sort of standoff with the Russians just seems, again, also really very risky. And perhaps the best way to do it is to try to work with these countries to try to sort of take some energy out of their argument that they need help, and they can only turn to the Russians for help by saying, we are actually prepared to help you. Although we might set some conditionality, but we're not closing the door and actually helping you.
So then, do we have to immediately? Basically, sanctions were imposed on Niger almost immediately after this coup. Do we have to suggest that these sanctions could be lifted in some fashion?
Well, I mean, at some point they become just kind of cruel and gratuitous, the way I think they were in Mali. Particularly for a country as absolutely desperately poor as Niger, which is the poorest of them all, as Joseph pointed out. At some point, it's just cruel. And it always remains the case that the elites are impervious to sanctions. It's the sort of the common people who suffer. The hope is that not that the people will rebel, it's more that other elites will sort of be sufficiently sober-minded to say, you know what, this is actually bad for us, and we need a course change in order to get the international community and the World Bank, et cetera, to re-engage with us. But if that doesn't happen, which was the case in Mali, where the Malians just tightened their belts, at some point, lift the sanctions, because otherwise it's just cruel.
Joseph, do you you're next? So where do you see us going in all of this?
No, I agree with Michael's point on sanctions. I mean, Niger is a country that relies on aid to sustain its food systems. I was
But in Afghanistan, for that matter, though, right? I mean, what happened there?
Yeah, but so I think the number before the coup, I think it was 1.5 million children under five with acute malnutrition. Within a month, this number is up to 2 million. So I think time matters for whatever the outcome will be. Time matters for the people there. But when it comes to democracy and Russian influence and Chinese influence, I think we're very, very much at an inflection point. And the French might have less economical interest in Africa now than they had 40 years ago. But I do believe that the free world should not step away from the largest growing continent. Niger has, I think, a birth rate of above 6. If we leave these people to autocratic regimes and to their own despair, it's going to be, problems for many, many years. And I'm not suggesting that we should intervene. I'm suggesting that we should be, controlling anything like that. But I think the fight for democracy is going to be essential in the coming month and in the coming year in these regions because of the increasing influence of China and Russia on the African continent.
Before we get away from that, there's an interesting question just come in from Aiden, who says the risk of this coup wave extending to the littoral of West Africa, Sahel, is unstable. But what about expansion to the Côte d'Ivoire or Senegal? Given the success of the jihadists and expansion there, what do you think about those being next, potentially, the Côte d'Ivoire or Senegal?
I mean, yes. Quite frankly, I mean, so in Togo, you've got a government that's very much like the Bongo government, right? It's just a family dynasty that acts like they own the country. That's less the case in the other countries. But the other countries have their own problems and their own frustrations, and we saw in Senegal with the riots and also the response of Macky Sall. There's sort of like a weakening of democratic commitments, and there is a real potential there. I don't expect there to be a coup in Senegal because that would be tragic if there were. But in the other countries, it's or Ghana, I should say. But I think it's a distinct possibility. We also have to look at Cameroon, and also I will say that because I am convinced that the security situation in Niger is going to decline rapidly. It's going to exacerbate the decline of security in Mali and Burkina Faso, and then sort of I don't want to make it sound I don't want to evoke dominoes, but the worse it gets in Mali and Burkina Faso, the greater the problems are going to be in all the littoral countries where we already have jihadist violence. Ghana, Togo, Benin, so far so good in Cote d'Ivoire. But it's all going to get worse, and it's going to get worse faster, I believe, as a direct result of what's going on now in Niger.
Yeah, I have a stake in the Cote d'Ivoire. They imprisoned me for one day in the lockup at the airport when I showed up there at the time of the 1985 coup.
I'm sure you deserved it.
It was quite an event. You'll be able to read about it actually on my Substack page, in my memoirs, Antolin Unleashed. Anyway, Karim, your final thoughts on where we're going in all of this?
I really like Michael's analysis. I agree with that 100%. That's very good. My opinion, unfortunately, is that the Western country, whatever we mean with this stuff, have not put their mind together that you don't bring democracy either with weapons or with one action. It's a 360 degrees plan. You have to really want it. You have to really, like they did for Europe in the Second World War, you really have to invest all you have into doing that. The stick and the carrot, but they have to work together. They have to be there. It's not like bomb there to kill the terrorist, put a sanction there against the coup, then changing your idea and going back and supporting the coup. You want democracy in Egypt, but then you are like General al-Sisi who makes a coup d'etat and you stand by him. All these contradictions put us as the West and the defensive into a losing spot in front of somebody who comes again. I don't care. Here is the money. You just let me get in.
Fair enough. We have an interesting, Peter, this last question is kind of intriguing, if I can just get to it here. Yes. How the West can help, particularly the Sahel region in general, Africa, to fight bad governance and corruption. How can the West work here? And does the West hold any kind of a solution and a path forward for most of these countries that have had this trauma in the last several years of coups? Peter, your final thoughts.
I don't know. Now I think for Mali, Burkina, Niger, we have rather to wait. One of the outcomes might be, that the situation deteriorates as much as people will come back to us and will ask for help. Then after we can work with them again. But otherwise, I think we don't have tools now. We are waking up to the new geopolitical situation, to the power struggle there, and we are still doing the same, which is not working. And I would get back to what Karim just said. If I got him properly, I think we have to to get those carrots, but also some sticks. We have to be tougher. We've been like in Mali and elsewhere. We've been, we've been too soft. Somebody asked for something, and the government didn't want to do it, so they got it from somebody else. It's difficult to push for other values once you have there the others offering it without it. It's a power struggle, and I think we have to understand it. And from this point of view, and I would get back to your previous question on US and French approach, I would say that the realist US approach is probably to be followed and to be more of the model than what we as Europeans have done. That's it. We have also probably work more as Europeans with other people on the ground, read better situation. We've been too focused on counterterrorism, also information-wise. That's why we didn't get that those coups are coming. So working more with NGOs, and not only in the capitals, go in the region, work, ask people in the region, go outside of the government. That's what has to be done to improve.
Well, that is a huge problem, isn't it? I know when I've been going around the world, I've reported from, I guess I'm up to about 89 countries right now in the course of my career. I found that very often going into the American embassies in some of these countries is almost a useless task, because they never get outside the embassy. They never get out and outside and talk to the people. I found the British, the French, the Germans, and a number of the other ambassadors, they get out there and they talk to the people. And that, I think, is a huge failing of American diplomacy in many of these parts of the world. I would ask if you share that. We have 2 minutes left. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that briefly, but maybe the American diplomatic system just doesn't work at this point in this part of Africa. I know that they've opened a couple of fabulous new embassy buildings, and they've trumpeted these. But is that model working in these countries? Does the United States know what it's doing, and is it doing it right?
Short answer is no.
Okay. Well, we still have a minute and a half, so
yeah. So I mean, I've long been convinced the whole FSO program is very problematic, because I feel like it's a bit of an anachronism in the way they sort of recruit. If you go through the recruitment process, it's really kind of bizarre, and it's not effective. And I'm going to add to that the embassies that I've been to in West Africa have all been very understaffed too. That doesn't help, right? So they have a whole problem with that. So the net with sort of not enough people, and those people might not be sufficiently motivated to be doing much of anything. And then, of course, you have a degree of risk aversion that I think is absolutely insane. So much so that when that young diplomat was killed in Libya, this might sound perverse, but I actually thought, like, well, good, in the sense that finally a diplomat that took some risk. Like, this is a good thing to be. Again, not that his death is bad, but the idea that the State Department actually put somebody in a dangerous position, in a sense, that's a good thing. And but the risk aversion that you find, you've got the security people, the RSOs at these embassies, it's like they're super risk averse. Yeah, so all of these problems compound. It's the way we do the sort of the foreign service officer as a profession, as a career, and then the behavior, the risk aversion of these countries. And the fact of the matter is that we have very little in-house expertise in Africa. And the number of people in Washington, D.C. who have any real strong interest or expertise vis-a-vis sub-Saharan Africa is actually very limited. And ultimately, they all get kind of sidelined because the United States simply has higher priorities, right? We are more interested in other things, and that's always just the reality. So you can go to the NSC and you can talk to their Africans, and they're fabulous people who know a lot, and they're great, they're super dedicated. But their amount of enthusiasm only goes far, because at a certain level,
nobody's
the government doesn't care. Nobody's really interested. Biden's busy, understandably, right? But that's just kind of the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad commentary, and I hate to end on a down note, but perhaps that's the model for the future to go ahead. And maybe Africa needs to really be, maybe some of these activities are actually going to raise consciousness and raise the attention of the needs of some of these places in Africa. We can only hope. So I think it's time to thank everyone, especially, by the way, Benjamin Mossberg, who we have not seen on camera, but who is very much there for his diligent and professional facilitation of all of this. Ambassador Yade, of course, for her invitation to me and to all of you, and especially her brilliant leadership of the Africa Center. And of course, do continue to follow all of our events at the Africa Center of the Atlantic Council. And I hope to be back here myself in the moderator's chair or on a panel before long. And otherwise, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.